Alright guys, and welcome back to the second part of the anatomy basics. So in the previous video we looked at the structures and makeup of the cells, the general terms of anatomy, what exactly anatomy and physiology is, all that good stuff. So make sure you check out that video. Now today in this video we're going to be looking at the different types of tissues. Then we'll be looking at the directional terms of the body and some of the regions that we find in the body. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into these cells, or excuse me, these tissues. So there's four major tissue types that we see in the body. One is epithelial tissue. The second is connective tissue. Then we have muscular tissue. And then last, we have nervous tissue. So as we said from the levels of organization in the previous video, we are a combination of cells grouping together to form tissues. So we know that these tissues are made up of billions and trillions of other cells of a like mind. Then these tissues come together to form organs. So organs are made up of all of these different tissue types. And then once these organs came together, we had organ systems, and then these organ systems came together, we had the organism. So let's go ahead and look at these individual layers of tissues. And I say the order in which I mentioned them is important. We said epithelial, connective, muscle. And then nervous is going to permeate throughout all of that. Why I say this is because that's usually the level in which we find them. Usually there's always a layer of epithelial on top of anything. And then we have a layer of connective tissue right underneath that epithelial layer. Then beneath the connective tissue is muscular tissue, which then is still permeated by connective tissue. We'll see that throughout the entire course, but all that good stuff. But that's usually the levels in which the tissues are found. It's epithelial, connective, and then muscular tissue. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the components and characteristics of these tissues. So first, epithelial tissue. Where exactly do we find epithelial tissue? Well, like I said, it's that first layer. So it is the first layer to find. If you touch anywhere inside and outside of your body, the first layer of what you're touching is epithelial tissue. So let's kind of grasp what I mean by that. So first, if I touch my skin, I am touching epithelial tissue. This epithelial tissue is the first layer of my skin. That's why we say the skin is the epidermis. Epi for one, on top of the dermis, but two, it's also made of epithelial tissue. So then epithelial, for definition of the next location we find it, lines the cavities and hollow spaces of our body. So anywhere that is hollow, the first layer of the walls of a hollow space is epithelial tissue, or any cavities of our body is lined with epithelial tissue. So let me try to paint the picture of what that means. So let's say I take a glass of water, the fingertips with epithelial tissue is grasping that water. I place that glass of water to my mouth and pour some water in. That water is now touching the lining of my mouth, which is the first layer of epithelial tissue. I swish that gulp of water to the back of my throat, which is still touching epithelial tissue, which is going down my esophagus, still touching epithelial tissue, going into my stomach, which is a hollow space, touching epithelial tissue, all the way through my digestive tract, touching epithelial tissue, no matter where it goes. So that is the open passageways of the body, right? So our mucous membranes, our nose, if I take a breath of air in, that air is touching mucous membranes, which is epithelial tissue. I hope that comes across pretty easy. Now, what do we mean by cavities of the body? Well, we have certain hollow spaces in the body where we find, again, a layer of epithelial tissue being the first layer. So for instance, we know that our chest cavity is hollow. Yes, we have it filled with organs and interstitial fluid and things like that, but the outside, on the other sides of those organs, is a hollow space. So for instance, we have the pleural cavity, the chest cavity here, or even the abdominal cavity is a hollow space with organs filled inside of it. So the walls, the lining of these hollow spaces is epithelial tissue. So literally epithelial tissue is everywhere in the first layer of tissue, no matter what you're touching. If you go inside a blood vessel and you touch the walls of being inside that blood vessel, it's epithelial tissue. It's all epithelial tissue, the first layer of anything you could touch. Hopefully that gets that. I know it's tough. I know I'm eccentric, but hopefully it came across. So what exactly does epithelial tissue do for you? Well, I like to think, since my skin, the first layer of my skin is epithelial tissue, I just kind of associate what the functions of my skin does for my body for epithelial tissue. So first and foremost, my skin protects my body, right? Obviously not great against a bullet or a knife or, other things that could scratch and scrape me, but it protects me from other outside things such as pathogens, bacteria, and things like that, and then, just dirt or whatever that might jump on me that wouldn't normally cause damage to the skin, but it reflects it, right? So protection is one major component or function and purpose of epithelial tissue. Then I think about my skin and I'm, walking outside, thanking the, divines that my skin is protecting me from the outside forces, and it's a really hot day, so I start to sweat. Well, I'm sweating, so I'm secreting fluids. So on the outside of my skin will secrete things such as sweat or oils, right? Because our skin is usually oily, right? We want to have that moisture content to it, so it secretes oils. Or say in organs, the lining of epithelium inside the organs might secrete, especially in the stomach, secretes digestive enzymes. So it secretes materials, whether it's waste material or good material. So secretion could also be lined up with excretion. So if it's waste material, we're excreting it. But if it's a good, useful product, we're secreting it. So secretion and excretion kind of go synonymously there in a little bit. Then, of course, our skin, right? If I was a smoker, which I'm not, thank God, if I put on a patch, say a smoke patch, a Nicoderm patch, or whatever they call them now, well, my skin is absorbing that nicotine from the patch, and it's absorbing it through my skin. So for instance, I took a drink of water, right, and it's going through my digestive tract, which is lined with epithelial tissue, right? It's going to absorb that water, right? Even if I, jump in the pool, my skin's still going to absorb water. So absorption is also another component and characteristic of epithelial tissue. So another function of epithelial tissue here is to sense things, right? As we know, on the outside of our skin, if a breeze came by, we'd feel it. If a fly was walking on our skin, we'd feel it. If, the liquid that we were drinking was hot or cold, we would feel it. So epithelial tissue is laden with sensory receptors to tell us things, so it can sense things. So sensation, absorption, secretion, excretion, protection, and what did I miss? I feel like I missed one. Yeah, that was it. So like we said, epithelial tissue is found, it's the first layer anywhere, whether we're outside the body, inside the body, in a hollow space, inside a cavity, whatever. Epithelial tissue is that first layer. So now we're moving into another type of tissue called connective tissue. And I could literally talk about this tissue all day. I'll try to save you from my ramblings here. So like we said, connective tissue is the next layer underneath that epithelial layer. So connective tissue harbors a lot of blood vessels and has a lot of nutrients applied to it, which is very important because one fact of epithelial tissue I failed to mention is what we call avascular. So A, we break down that root word, A means lacking or without. So avascular, vascular or vessel, referring to blood vessels, this lacks the supply of blood vessels, which means it doesn't have a direct supply of nutrients. The epithelial tissue gets its nutrients from the connective tissue through what we call a basement membrane. We'll see that later, so don't worry about that right now. But know that the epithelial tissue is avascular, while the connective tissue is very vascular. So connective tissue, being right under that epithelial tissue, provides nutrients, one structure, one important function for it, but it also, next, provides the framework of your body. It'll also help protect your body. It'll also help transport material throughout your body. So where exactly do we find connective tissue? Well, I'll tell you, it's everywhere. It literally permeates throughout everything. Every single thing we're going to see in the body is essentially wrapped and encased in some form of connective tissue. A connective tissue is just the most important, in my opinion, in relation to massage therapy, the most important tissue type next to maybe nervous tissue that we need to pay attention to for our body work. Even like I say as a massage therapist, I don't even work for muscles anymore. I work for the connective tissues. Now the science might change and change my opinion, but connective tissues to me is the most important tissue type to really look at and understand. So I'm going to try to be very brief with this. So being that connective tissue is found everywhere, there are many different types of connective tissue. So we can have fibrous connective tissue. So fibrous connective tissue comes in many types. So we could have what we call loose fibrous connective tissue or an adipose connective tissue. So typically we like to group these two together because they're usually found hand in hand. So loose connective tissue is a very loose matrix of connective tissue, usually very webby and spacey and all that good stuff. And inside of this loose connective tissue, adipose deposits itself. Adipose connective tissue is a connective tissue type that is fat. So adipose is fat. So the fat, the connective tissue that is adipose, coagulates and then deposits into that loose matrix. So we usually associate that as loose adipose connective tissue. So I usually just group those two together because they're usually found pretty synonymously and hand in hand. So we then we'd also have reticulin. We're not going to really care about that. But we also have dense fibrous connective tissue. And when it comes to dense fibrous connective tissue, we have two types. We have dense regular and dense irregular. So dense regular connective tissue, regularity and irregularity are referring to the directions of the fibers. So what do I mean by that? Well, if it's dense regular connective tissue, that it means its fiber directions are running roughly parallel and in a straight line. It's very regular, neat, and organized. So examples of dense regular fibrous connective tissue are tendons and ligaments. So these tissues, these fibers of this tissue run straight back and forth. So we know that a ligament goes from A to B and its fibers run in the same direction. So dense irregular connective tissue is a type of connective tissue that its fiber pattern and direction is very irregular. It essentially has no pattern to it. It's cross-hatching and going in every which way. So an example of the irregular connective tissue is what we would call fascia. So fascia is that tissue that starts, so if we were looking at the skin, we have the epithelial layer being the epidermis, then we have the dermis, which is connective tissue, which then merges into what we call superficial fascia, which is a layer of tissue that covers the muscles. Then the superficial fascia goes through and permeates every single muscle fiber, muscle cell, all the way down to bone, creating what we call the periosteum. Now, of course, it's a lot to throw on you at once, but we're going to see that many times over in the coming courses. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this. Fascia, it's all, your body is the fascia. I am your fascia. Body. And the fascia is what I really like to work for when I'm dealing with massage therapy. So as we mentioned, this fascia is going all the way down to bone. And bone itself is a form of connective tissue. It is a matrix of mineral salts and deposits and calcium and all of this other stuff in a matrix of connective tissue that is now hardened and has become solidified into bone. So bone is technically connective tissue. It's the only part of your connective tissue that will stay around for a long, long time. So bone is a type of connective tissue. And then another type of connective tissue we could have is cartilaginous connective tissue. So we know kind of what cartilage is, right? We know, we've heard the word at least, but we have three different types of cartilage in the body. We have elastic cartilage, which is kind of dense but very pliable. So elastic cartilage would be like my nose here or my ears, right? That's elastic cartilage. It moves pretty easily, but it's, still kind of sturdy. Then we have fibrocartilage, which is very hard and very dense. Fibrocartilage is usually what binds the plates of your skull or found in other cartilaginous structures. The easiest example would be the platings of your skull. Then the last form of cartilage is very important for massage therapists to remember when it comes to taking your MBLEX is hyaline cartilage. The hyaline cartilage is the type of cartilage we find on what we call the articulating surfaces of bones. So if you ever ate a piece of chicken, if you're not a vegan or whatever, or maybe you've seen, even if you don't eat meat, someone eating a piece of chicken in disgust, of course, and you saw that at the ends of the bone were these pearly white tips, these pearly white parts. Well, that pearly white part, or as some people call it, the gristle, is the connective tissue known as hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage is found where two bones come together and move around on each other. So that hyaline cartilage is what prevents the bones from grinding and gritting into each other and causing pain and discomfort, or in what case we would call arthritis, because osteoarthritis is the degeneration of the hyaline cartilage found in those joints. So the last form of connective tissue we'll see is blood. Blood is technically a liquid matrix of connective tissue. So you can see just how easy it is to understand that this connective tissue is everywhere in your body. So the next tissue type we're looking at is muscular tissue. Now we're going to break down muscular tissue in a later lecture, but the muscular tissue comes in three types of tissue, and that's what we're going to see is the overview. We have skeletal muscle tissue, we have smooth muscle tissue, and we have cardiac muscle tissue. So easy enough to say and assume that skeletal muscle tissue is found attaching itself to the skeleton, right? Skeletal muscle, skeleton. So the skeletal muscle is attached to the skeleton. Smooth muscle tissue is usually found found on organs or other structures. So for instance, the muscles that make your hair stand on end are smooth muscles. Certain muscles that are found in the GI tract are smooth. And then of course the muscle layers that make up most of your organs are smooth types of muscle. And then the last type of muscle tissue we said was cardiac muscle tissue, and that one has to be the easiest because we just know and need to associate cardiac with the heart. So this muscle tissue is found only in the heart. Now, when it comes to these three different types of muscle tissue, we talk about their voluntary actions, whether they're involuntary or voluntary, whether they act off of will or they act because that's what they need to do. So two of these types of muscle tissue are what we call involuntary, meaning that these muscle types of tissue will work regardless if we think and tell them to work. The other type of muscle tissue is going to work when we think and want it to, for the most part. So the type of muscle tissue that we can control consciously with our minds is the skeletal muscle tissue. We can consciously control that I contract and I'm moving my hands and arms as I'm talking with my hands as I'm Italian. So this whole time that we're looking at the skeletal muscles, it's voluntary action. I'm not walking around, like a weekend at Bernie's, and I'm not just moving my arms and flailing because I can't control them. It's like, sorry, no, you can't control these. No, we can control skeletal muscle. However, we can't control the smooth muscle, so we can't control how organs function, right? Organs are going to function regardless, and we can't control, we can't control our heart. We can't control our heart muscles to not work or to work in a certain way. Debatable, like yes, you can do exercises to help calm yourself and, try to do a mental thing to help calm the heart, but you couldn't just consciously, try to stop your heart in that fashion. So we call that an involuntary type of muscle. So the last tissue type we're looking at is nervous tissue. Now we're going to get into a lot of detail with the nervous tissue in the nervous system. But the one thing we want to know is that nervous tissue is composed of nervous cells, and the nervous cell is what we call a neuron. A neuron is a nervous cell. It is the basic building block of a nerve. And that's where we're going to leave it at. So when it comes to these tissues, we know that life is not always easy. And of course, I don't mean financially and things like that, but I mean that we fall down, but we get up again, and we might get a bruise or scrape or whatever along the way. So in that case, we'll need to repair from damage. So there's a few ways in which tissues repair, and the tissue repair always starts with what we call inflammation. So, a very touchy word, a word that gets a very bad rep, right? Inflammation. Inflammation is usually made to be the villain, right? And in some cases it is, but we got to understand the nature of inflammation. Inflammation is the first process in healing. So inflammation, in a sense, is a good thing. Now, when inflammation is in excess, that's usually a negative situation and usually denotes itself to a pathology. So any pathology that has itis in its name, itis means inflammation. So this is an inflammatory condition of whatever we're talking about. So when it comes to inflammation, and we're talking about good inflammation, there's a few characteristic signs of inflammation. We can use the acronym of what we say SHARP, S-H-A-R-P. So SHARP is the little breakdown of what we would see. So S means swelling. So let's put the idea that we sprained our ankle. So we sprained our ankle, right? It's going to swell up. H, heat, right? So in the area, blood is going to flow, which creates more heat. So, and it might feel, hot to the touch or radiate heat. So swelling and heat are two major signs of inflammation. Then we look at A. A stands for a loss of function. Clearly, if I just sprained my ankle, I'm not going to be walking as if I was just prior, right? I'm going to be limping and probably not even walking on it at all. So a loss of the function of the structure occurs when inflammation or damage, tissue damage, comes into play. Then we look at R, which stands for redness. So redness is another characteristic sign of inflammation, usually because of the extra blood flow into the area. We have blood, obviously looks red. So this extra blood flow, which is trying to bring nutrients and flush stuff out of the area, is coming in at a more increased rate. And then of course, the P stands for pain, like it's gonna hurt, which is a good thing because pain tells you something's wrong. So the pain is what's probably keeping you from trying to function at normal capacity and giving you that loss of function because it knows like you need to not be moving that or working it. It needs to heal. Pain is a good thing. I know we try to run from pain as much as possible, but we need to sometimes give in to our pain. So with inflammation out of the way, understanding what inflammation looks like, well, let's look at how tissues repair. There's two ways tissues repair, two methods in which tissues repair. Either they will regenerate or they will remodel. So regeneration is the development of new functional tissue. remodeling is essentially making do with what you have. You're essentially just, oh, well, I broke this vase. I'm just going to, you know, kind of glue some pieces back together, and yeah, it is what it is, right? Regeneration is, well, like this vase broke and it were to just put itself back together, you know, it would have, you know, maybe some fault lines where that new material came in, but whatever, right? So regeneration, say for instance, if you had a surgery, right, they cut into the skin, you know, the skin and all that has a high ability to regenerate. So then we would have what we call a scar tissue. So scar tissues are usually the sign of regeneration. Remodeling would be, like I said, if we, you know, cut a nerve, well, it might try to divert the path through another nerve to find sensation elsewhere. So if, you know, one area was innervated by a nerve and we had, you know, 3 different nerves going to it and we cut the center one, well, it would still try to remodel and use the peripheral nerves or whatever. We wouldn't have that direct connection, but hey, whatever. So 2 different types, regeneration and remodeling. And now when it comes to regeneration, we look at these tissue types in that some of these tissue types have a very easy time to regenerate, namely epithelial tissue and connective tissue. Epithelial tissue and connective tissue have the highest capacities to regenerate and develop scar tissues. Muscle tissue and nervous tissue have the least capabilities of regeneration, and so they typically will remodel. So keep that in mind when it comes to dealing with your client's injuries in that way. So we've looked at how tissues repair, we looked at the inflammation, we've looked at these tissue types, so let's take a look at those tissue types in relation to membranes. We've kind of mentioned them before. So we have 2 different types of membranes. We can have epithelial membranes, or we could have connective tissue membranes. Let's go ahead and just knock out the connective tissue membranes first because it's very easy. The connective tissue membrane that we see is what we call the synovial membrane. Synovial membrane. So the synovial membrane is the membrane that we find inside a joint, and this membrane is responsible for secreting synovial fluid, which then helps lubricate and nourish the joint during its movements. So connective tissue membranes, synovial membrane, synovial fluid in the joint, right? I just want you to associate all of those together. Now the next membrane type we said was epithelial membranes, and we find a few different types. So we have one, cutaneous epithelial membranes. Well, cutaneous, like our skin, right? Cutaneous area. So that is the layer or membrane that is our skin. Then we have mucous membranes. So mucous membranes line the inside passageways of our body. So our entire GI tract is lined with a mucous membrane. Our nasal passageway is lined with a mucous membrane. So the mucous membrane is found in those passageways through the body. Then lastly, we have what we call a serous epithelial membrane. Now this one's a little tough because the serous membrane is that membrane, that epithelial lining we said, that lines those body cavities. So coming back to that example that we had, the thoracic cage, the rib cage here, this is a hollow space, right? Let's say let's go ahead and put the lungs in there, and then we put the heart in there, right? So all the space around the heart and lungs is hollow. So the serous membrane lines that hollow space. It lines both the border and the actual organs. So there's 2 parts to the serous membrane. One being what we call the parietal. The parietal serous membrane lines the walls. So for instance, let's say this chest cavity is my house, right? This is a house. And I had in my house some furniture. Let's say the only piece of furniture I had in the room of my house was a couch. Well, if I put wallpaper up on my wall, that would be my parietal serous layer. So that is the serous layer, that is the membrane that covers the walls of my house. So the parietal membrane covers the walls of the chest cavity. Then let's say I'm super nitpicky about my couch and keeping it preserved. I put one of those very uncomfortable plastic covers on the couch. Well, that plastic cover would be what we call the visceral serous membrane. So the visceral serous membrane. Visceral means organ. So this is the serous membrane. This is the membrane that covers the organs in those cavities. So the two types of the membranes of serous style found in the body. So we'll see that come to play when we look at the rib cage and we look at the abdominal contents in later lectures. So for now, those are going to be our membranes. Like we said, epithelial and connective tissue membranes. Connective tissue, very easy, just synovial, found in joints. The epithelial membranes were the cutaneous, which is found in the skin, and then the mucus, which is found in the passageways of the body, and then the serous membranes, which is found in the cavities of the body. So with that said, let's look at some of these different cavities of the body. So obviously we saw, and we've been using the chest cavity as a big example, so we call that the thoracic cavity. Then, of course, it's partitioned, our rib cage is partitioned off from the stomach by a diaphragm, a muscle called the diaphragm. So that diaphragm, that muscle, partitions these two cavities, one being my thoracic cavity, and then my other being my abdominal cavity. Now, both of these cavities are on the front of our body. So we call these cavities the ventral cavities. Ventral meaning forward or on the front. So ventral cavities are the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Now, since we have ventral cavities, we're also going to look at what we call dorsal cavities. Dorsal, very easy, like a dorsal fin is on our back. The dorsal cavities are on the back of our body. So what exactly do we have on the back of our body? What hollow spaces do we have on the back of our body? Well, one, there's a hollow space up in here. Luckily, we fill it with a brain. Most people do, at least, right? So this hollow space up in here houses our brain, and that's actually a cavity. We call that the cranial cavity. Very easy to understand, right? And then inside the spine, there is a column, a hollow space made by all of these vertebrae where our spinal cord passes through. Or we call this our spinal column or our spinal cavity. This is the cavity where our spine sits, right? So those are the cavities of our body. We have the ventral cavities being the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity, and then we have the dorsal cavities being the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. So let's go ahead and look at some of these terms here. So we're talking about cranial, spinal, abdominal, all these things. Let's take a brief moment to talk about our relationship of movements of the body, positions and everything. We did say that anatomy was the study of the structures of the human body and their positional relationship to one another. Let's go ahead and look at some of those terms that give us that positional relationship. So first, we look at superior versus inferior. Superior is a word, like if you have a superior at your job, that's a person whose pay grade is higher above you. Or if you are the superior, you have someone who is inferior to you. So superior means situated above, inferior means situated below. Then when we look at the body, we also can use words such as medial and lateral. Medial means closer towards the center of the body, while lateral means coming out towards the side. We can then use words like anterior and posterior. Anterior meaning viewed from the front of the body, posterior meaning viewed from the back of the body. So the key thing to note is viewed from the front or viewed from the back. Because I could say, so here's my sternum. Even though the sternum is forward, right, it's very anterior of my body, it's, in the front of my body, I still have an anterior surface of my sternum and a posterior surface. So clearly I can stand outside the skeleton and look directly at that sternum, and that's the anterior surface. But if I got up into the thoracic cage and I was on the inside looking out, then I would be looking at the posterior surface of the sternum. So other terms that we see are proximal and distal. Now proximal and distal are words that relate to the extremities. And proximal and distal mean whether it's closer to the body or distal or further away. So proximal means closer, distal means further away. And by closer, I mean what's more closely connected to the body. Like if you follow the chain of my arm, like my shoulder is literally my humerus, the head of my humerus is attached to my shoulder blade. So the head of my humerus is the most proximal part of my arm. So I would say that my hand is more distal than, say, my elbow, right? My elbow is more proximal than my hand. So my elbow is closer to my body than my hand is, and my hand is more distal than my elbow is to my body. So distal and proximal, words relating to the extremities of their distance away from the body. And then there's plenty of others there. We'll look at like caudal versus cranial. Caudal means you're more towards the head end, caudal is more towards the tail end. Cranial is more towards the head end. So cranial, caudal, and we'll see those throughout the different courses. For now, we're just look at those super basic terms: inferior, superior, lateral, medial, proximal, distal, anterior, posterior. Those are going to get us away for a good while. Now, when it comes to the body, we can divide it up in many ways. One of the ways is planes. So we have planes that dissect our body into two parts. Dissect, right? Dissect two parts. So the first is what we call the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane cuts us into left and right parts. If the sagittal plane cut us into equal left and right parts, we call that the mid-sagittal plane. So there's a difference between sagittal and mid-sagittal. Mid-sagittal is straight down the center. Sagittal is, off to the side, cutting anywhere else. So then we have what we call the transverse plane. The transverse plane cuts us across. Transverse is a word meaning across. So the transverse plane would cut us straight across, just like this. So it'd be like wearing a waist belt, and that waist belt comes across our body. Or a waist trainer, or a necklace. That necklace comes across our body. It's creating this transverse plane. Then we could have what we call the frontal plane. Now that one's simple because the frontal plane divides us into front and back parts. So frontal plane could divide us into anterior and posterior parts. Then lastly, we also have the oblique plane, which comes at an angle. Oblique just means angle. Now, looking at some of these other parts and breaking down parts of the body, we can look at the quadrants of the stomach or the abdomen. The abdomen can be broken into quadrants. So making it very easy, we can have an upper right quadrant and an upper left quadrant. We could have a lower right quadrant and a lower left quadrant. Makes it very simple. Now, there are 9 different regions to the abdominal contents here as well. So we could have the epigastric area. We could have the hypochondriac regions on the side, left and right. Then we could have the umbilical with the left and right lumbar. And then we could have the hypogastric with the, all that good stuff. So I'm not going to really make you know that. You can look it up and test yourself on it. But basically dividing it into 9 squares instead of the 4 just gives you more definition of where structures are located. So one thing to really understand is when we're looking at all of these directional terms are derived looking at the body in a particular way. We look at the body and derive all of these terms from what we call anatomical position. What exactly is anatomical position? Anatomical position is a body that is standing straight up, facing forward, hands down to the side, and our palms are facing forward. I know I can't really show you how to zoom out a little bit, get back a little bit, but this would be anatomical position. Our hands are facing forward, our feet are facing forward, our bodies are facing forward. Basically, this is how people were dissected. They were laying on a slab dead, and that's how we study them. So we're like, oh, okay, well, referencing all of these positions from this orientation of the body is how we're gonna do it, right? So it's just like holding a map, right? If I hold a map, well, I need to know which way is north, because if I didn't know which way is north and I'm holding this map any which way, and I'm all SOL, right? I can't figure out where I'm going. So anatomy, like we said, is the map of the body, and we need to orient our map properly. So that orientation, our compass rose, comes from anatomical position. Like we said, standing straight, facing forward, palms down to the side, and facing forward. So lastly, let's go over a few regions of the body, some few common regions of the body. So most of the regions are named after the bones that we find them. So first we have the cranial region, right? We have the thoracic region or the rib cage region. We have the abdominal region. We have the lumbar region. We have the pelvic region. We have the region where the femur is, called the femoral region. We have the humeral region, or what we call the brachial region, because brachial means arm, it's the region of the humerus. Then we have the antebrachial, which is the forearm. And then dividing that, we could base it off of which side or which bone we're looking at. So we could have the radial side, we could have the ulnar side, right? We have the carpal region, which is the wrist. We have the palmar region of the hand, you know, the digits of the body. You know, breaking it down further into the lower leg, we have, you know, the crural region, sural region. We have the ankle. We have the, you know, the tarsals, the tarsal bones being of the foot, and then all that good stuff. So, you know, go ahead and take a look in your book and maybe search it online for all of the other nitty-gritty regions. Now, of course, we're going to see these come play in subsequent lectures, but to keep this video down for the sake of time, I'm going to have to end it there. So with that said, take your notes, rewatch this video if you need, send me any comments or questions that you might have, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great one.